Is your Vindicator not vindictive enough for you? Have you considered giving it one of the biggest laser cannons in the entire game? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're back for another Space Marine Forge World unit review. This one scored highly in one of our Patreon polls that we have semi-regularly on the channel, where the channel's Patreons can vote on which videos to come next. One of the highest scoring out of the Space Marine Forge World units was the Vindicator laser destroyer, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. In this video we'll take a look at its rules, talk about how we can get more out of it on the table, and how I would try and maximise its effectiveness in a game of 40k. In the background, the Vindicator laser destroyer is a tank destroying variant of the standard Vindicator. Instead of a demolisher cannon, it packs a mighty laser destroyer array, a ludicrously potent weapon that easily has the ability to shear tanks in half with a single shot. First retrofitted under the heavily armoured Deimos pattern Vindicator in the dark days of the Horus Heresy, several legions took to fielding this variant as a mainline battle tank, proving itself on many occasions to be an absolutely adequate tank hunter. Few of these rare variants exist in the armories of the more storied chapters of the 41st millennium, but when they are called forth to war again, there is little in the way of enemy armour that will stand in their way. So let's see what this thing can do on the tabletop then. A Deimos pattern Vindicator laser destroyer will cost you 183 points to field in-game. It's got a slightly improved profile in terms of durability compared with the standard Vindicator. It still retains the standard toughness 8, but it goes up to 12 wounds, so it's a little bit more durable, but obviously less so point for point, because the standard Vindicator is so much cheaper at 125 points. It's armed with a laser volley cannon and a storm bolter, and it can also choose to take a hunter-killer missile if you should so wish. Obviously the star of the show is going to be that laser volley cannon, so let's see what it does. The laser volley cannon has two firing modes, volley fire and overcharge fire, and when considering the two fire modes, you also have to consider its power capacitor rule, which means that if it doesn't move in the movement phase, it can fire twice with this volley cannon, but must use volley fire twice in a row. As an advantage over the standard Vindicator, both profiles are 36 inches in range, rather than 24 inches, which somewhat limits the Vindicator's standard demolisher cannon. They're both only heavy 2 weapons though, as opposed to the standard Vindicator's D6, although technically volley fire would be a 4-shot weapon most of the time, provided you're standing still. So volley fire is 36 inches, heavy 2 weapon, with strength 9, AP-3, and a flat damage of 3. And the overcharge fire is 36 inches, heavy 2, with strength 10, AP-5, and a flat damage of 6, which frankly isn't something that we see very much in the game of 40k. It is quite fun to think that if you do convert those hit and wound rolls, then overcharge fire would easily one-shot virtually any standard battle line tank. However, overcharge fire does come with a risk, much like plasma weapons, and if you get any hit rolls of 1 with the weapon, then the firing vehicle suffers 3 mortal wounds. I think it's quite a nice touch though that if you do roll snake eyes, you still only take the 3 rather than taking a massive 6. On average, against a standard toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, overcharge fire will typically net you around about 4 wounds against them, provided you don't have any other rerolls, and Space Marines do typically have rerolls. And volley fire, firing twice, will actually net you around about 4.5 to 5 wounds. So if you are standing stationary and your target doesn't have a 2+ save, then typically volley fire is going to do you better. It's a little bit more damaging against most targets, and of course you have no chance to blow yourself up with mortal wounds. If moving, then it's usually going to be the overcharge fire that's far better, but bear in mind that if you're moving, you'll be -1 to hit, so you'll have far better chance of burning yourself out with overcharging, unless you have something to counter that, such as Iron Hands, Ultramarines, or Big Guns Never Tire or something. The model has all the standard Space Marine special rules in Angels of Death, giving it combat doctrines most importantly. The overcharge fire doesn't really care too much as its AP is great, but volley fire could get up to AP-4 in the first battle round, which helps it do even better than overcharge fire. The model has the standard explodes rule with D3 mortal wounds around it if you roll 6, and also has smoke launchers if you do need to reposition or something that you can opt to use instead of shooting. So overall, it's a tank that will be fairly happy sat somewhere in your deployment zone stationary, repeatedly zapping things with that laser volley cannon on volley fire, with overcharge being a bit more attractive if it's either moving, or if it needs some sort of niche application where you need a really high damage output. So let's talk about how to get a bit more out of it in-game. First chapter choice can certainly help out. Ultramarines aren't a bad shout, as their tactical doctrine can allow it to move and shoot for no penalty, so you can have it wandering around firing overcharge fire. and if it ever gets locked up in close combat, it'll still be able to back out and do some damage output. Iron Hands is always great for vehicles, with slower degrading, a nice 6+ feel no pain and better overwatch, and of course they also have their Doctrine on turn 1, which means you could move it and still fire it safely on overcharge, and it would be even safer as it would also get to reroll 1s. Raven Guard could put it always in cover outside 12 inches, which is a decent durability buff, and Salamanders have good affinity with it as well, their rerolls going excellently with a low shot weapon, particularly like overcharge fire, but volley fire will still benefit quite a lot. Imperial Fists for ignore cover could certainly be handy, and might be a factor on the damage output of the laser volley cannon on volley fire. And Dark Angels is quite a good pairing with this one as well, having reroll 1s when stationary for a bit of extra damage output, as this thing wants to be stationary most of the time anyway, and the extra 6-inch range can certainly help out when you've only got 36 inches to play with. Space Wolves could also be kind of handy for this thing when it's targeting anything with -1 to hit, as they can use keen senses. In terms of character support, I think that this is a good example of a fire-based unit that you will be able to get a fair bit more out of with the appropriate rerolls. It'd just love to be in Chapter Master or Captain Aura, and Lieutenants can help out too. As normal with vehicles, Tech Marines can repair it, and the Master of the Forge from Faith and Fury that can give it +1 to hit is also a very nice welcome addition. If you did put it in Chapter Master and Lieutenant Aura, its average damage output goes up to somewhere around 7 wounds per turn when it's firing volley fire, and even more if it's in the Devastator Doctrine too. Chaplain Litanies could also help, although they might be better served on a slightly bigger model such as a Repulsor Executioner or something to make them more efficient, and in theory you could use psychic buffs on it such as the Salamander's -1 to hit or +1 toughness, or Might of Heroes from the main codex to make it toughness 9. In terms of stratagems, re-rolling a wound roll with the thing, particularly on overcharge fire, could actually be a really reasonable use of a command point if it's going to make the difference between 6 damage or not. Big Guns Never Tire is also a really solid stratagem to use when it's moving and shooting and wanting to overcharge. You want to avoid it having to take 3 mortal wounds on roll of a 2 as well. In general, I wouldn't tend to go too crazy on stratagems with this thing, and just let it be a bit of a consistent damage dealer in its own right. So how would I use one of these guys in game then? For me, one of its main advantages over the Vindicator is its longer range, meaning that it doesn't really have the same battlefield role, to be honest. Having 36-inch range means that you could easily just sit it somewhere towards the front of your deployment zone and have good range on the vast majority of enemy units in the midfield. I think you really want to think very hard about where you're putting it, and somewhere where it's not going to get charged and locked up, but it's also going to be able to keep on firing every turn, as it's only really all that efficient when it's stationary and also has a target it wants to shoot. As I said, I think I'd want to be keeping it with things like captains and lieutenants to get more damage output out of it, and you could absolutely have them buffing this and a bunch of other tanks about as well, to really help propel it to the next level. From there you just shoot away at any enemy tanks until all of the relevant targets are dead, then you're going to have to move up to try and get it in range of something else, and you can take the decision as to whether or not to use overcharge fire when you do, as it will be better than the volley fire for damage output, but still risk you getting some mortal wounds, so it's a bit of a trade-off between the two, to be honest. The main question for us really comes as to whether or not it's more efficient than its rivals. Unfortunately, if we do compare it to the standard Vindicator, it's just nowhere near on the same level in terms of raw damage output, point for point. The Demolisher Cannon's really not all that far behind the volley fire when it's firing twice, and of course the Vindicator's 125 points, and this one's 183. So it's massively more points efficient in terms of that, and also more durable point for point as well, so the Vindicator is overall a better unit for being a Vindicator. This one does have the advantage of having longer range though, which means that it could be sitting back and not having to go moving up quite as much as the Vindicator does, and that is a significant advantage. It might make it in a bit more contention with some of the bigger Space Marine ranged anti-tank units, where it does compare at least fairly well against things like Contemptor Dreadnoughts and things, particularly if you're in Chapter Master auras. Contemptor Mortis Dreadnoughts with quad las cannons are some of the most efficient long-ranged anti-tank Space Marines have access to. I think it does compete at least reasonably with them. Compared with these guys, point for point it is less damage output and it's shorter ranged, as Contemptors have 4 las cannons hitting on 2s and are a bit cheaper. The Contemptors are also more mobile because they can still move and still fire to maximal effect, whereas this one halves its volley firepower, forcing you into overcharge if you want it to have efficient damage output. However, it does have the advantage of having really quite decent durability point for point compared with the Contemptors. 10 wounds at toughness 7 with a 5+ invul in a lot of cases might be easier to chew through compared with toughness 8 and 12 wounds. I think in reality this thing is still just a little bit overpointed compared with the Vindicator or the Contemptors, and struggles to compete with them quite as well in a purely optimised list, but is not all that far behind them, and it wouldn't hamper your output of your army quite so much if you are including it in lieu of one of these options. so certainly not top tier competitive I'm afraid, but it wouldn't take much of a points reduction to make it pretty much even to the other choices. Maybe we can hope for a bit of an update whenever Games Workshop gets around to redoing the Forge World books. Let me know your thoughts on this guy down in the comments below. Is it worth it just for having the fun factor and massive damage 6 weapon, or would you rather just stick with the trusty demolisher cannon? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more 40k content, including plenty more for Space Marines over the coming weeks. And if you've been enjoying the videos recently, consider supporting the channel on Patreon, as it is what keeps these videos coming. You get to vote on what sort of videos come next for the channel, including decisions like this one, which was entirely a choice made by the Patreons, and you also get to see some videos early and have the occasional chance of winning prize draws where I post out some models to Patreons every couple of months. If any of that interests you, or you'd just like to see more coming from the channel, then the link is down in the description below, and of course a massive thank you to my current Patreons for making this possible. In any case, a big thank you for listening, I'll hope to see you guys next time.